Please begin by making yourselves very, very comfortable. This meditation has been created to help you understand some basic ideas that have the power to help you expand your awareness of self and liberate any bonds that are holding you back and preventing you from living your authentic life. When children are born, it is not their fault that they do not know that they are enough. When children are born, it is not their fault that they need a sense of love to be mirrored back to them in order to believe that they are enough. It is not your fault if, as a child, you were taught to believe that what you felt was unimportant or irrelevant. It is not your fault if, as a child, you believed what you saw. It is not your fault if, as a child, you did not know that the adults in your life were asleep. It is not your fault if you did not understand that human beings have the ability to be both conscious and unconscious at the same time. It is not your fault if, as a child, what you saw, you believed and interpreted as truth. It is not your fault if you never felt seen. It is not your fault if you never felt enough. It is not your fault if your parents never felt enough. It is not your fault if your parents never felt seen. It is not your fault if your parents suffered with addictions, depression, or any other emotional or mental health issue. It is not your fault if you could not save your parents from themselves. It is not your fault if you grew up in a home full of anger and angst, anxiety, trauma, and abuse. It is not your fault if your needs went unmet. It is not your fault if the people who raised you were unable to meet your needs. It is not your fault you had needs. It is not your fault you required love in order to believe you were love. It is not your fault if the people who raised you were abusive and in denial of how their actions were molding the belief systems that would one day run your life. It is not your fault you were born asleep. It is not your fault that the nature of the mind is both conscious and unconscious at the same time. It is not your fault you lived in a state of survival. It is not your fault you learned to shut down. It is not your fault you feared criticism and punishment. It is not your fault you were called names, minimized, marginalized, or victimized. It is not your fault that what you needed you did not receive. It is not your fault that you grew up believing that you were not enough. It is not your fault that children all presume that when they are unable to gain the validation of their parents, that they assume it is their fault they were unable to gain their parents' love. It is not your fault all children judge their worth by how worthy their parents treat them. It is not your fault that all children need to feel seen in order to be able to see the self. It is not your fault if today you feel disconnected from your authentic self. It is not your fault all children need to feel attuned to their parents in order to feel attuned to the self. It is not your fault if your home was one of chaos and unpredictability. It is not your fault you grew up in an unpredictable home. It is not your fault you needed to dissociate and to flee your feelings in order to survive. It is not your fault if you suffer from low self-worth today, if the people you loved refused to see or were unable to see worth in you. It is not your fault if others were unable or too unconscious to see worth in you. It is not your fault if those who raised you saw no worth in themselves and therefore could not see worth in others. It is not your fault if the people who raised you treated you the way they were treated as children. It is not your fault that people who were supposed to love you may not have. It is not your fault if you never felt connected to. It is not your fault if today you struggle with healthy relationships. It is not your fault if the relationships of the past were unhealthy. It is not your fault if today you crave love like you crave air. It is not your fault you were denied the love you deserved and needed. It is not your fault if today you feel invisible to the self. It is not your fault you were raised by people who are unable to see themselves. It is not your fault you are in pain. It is not your fault if you fear that you are not enough. It is not your fault if today you are confused as to what to do about how you feel. It is not your fault if you do not know how to honor what you feel. is not your fault. You were raised by people who did not honor how you felt. All children are programmed to see themselves the way their parents and or caretakers or authority figures in their lives have seen them. All children are impacted by the input and quality of their environments. All internal environments are the result of what we have experienced externally. Today, we can awaken. We can rise up out of the subconscious mind. We can understand that we have been asleep and running patterns from the past. Today, we can understand that it's not us, it's just our programming. And if we stay on the path, we can continue and will break through. Today, remember, you are enough. Today, remember, you were never not enough. Today, remember, the past is but a dream. It is time to awaken to the reality that you are enough. You are enough. Dear one, you are enough. Namaste.